Many Muslims say the Bible has contradictions in it. Because of those contradictions, they say the Bible must be corrupted. We can give a great answer to this. Dr. Javad Hashmi, a Muslim scholar, gives a good example of how to think about it. But there's a catch. No matter how good our answer is, some Muslims will say this: fine. But the Gospels aren't the Injil anyway. The Injil was one book given to Jesus. You have 4 books written by other people. That reply ends the conversation only if you would like to continue talking about the Gospels or even give a defense of the Gospels. So the master key method is usually the better tool to use in Muslim conversations. Still, the answer below is worth knowing for your own understanding of Gospels. The Muslim says, there are contradictions and errors in the Gospels, thus the Gospels are corrupted. The Muslim argument has a problem built into the question itself. It assumes that a holy book like the Quran or the Bible must be perfect, word for word, in every detail, including small historical details. If it isn't, then Muslims assume the scripture must be corrupted and is not from God. But Muslim Quran scholar Dr. Hashmi mentions that viewing scripture this way is not how scripture actually works. And here's the interesting part. Muslim scholars run into the very same issue in the Quran. Dr. Javad Hashmi is a Muslim Quran scholar from Harvard University. He points out places where the Quran is historically inaccurate. He does not say this to attack the Quran. He says these changes were made on purpose so the stories would connect better with the Arab audience hearing them. Here are some of the following. In the Quran story retelling, when Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt, God gave Israelites Egypt as their inheritance in addition to the promised land, Canaan. Dr. Hashmi says this retelling comes from a surah given during the later Meccan period. The point of the change was to match Muhammad's own life. Muhammad ended up inheriting both Medina and Mecca. So the story of Moses was shaped to echo that, which helped Arabs connect an old story to their own prophet. Number 3. The Quran has details that are not historically accurate. While the Quran poses Dhul Qarnayn as a monotheist, several pre-Muhammad story element motifs in the Quranic story trace to legends regarding a historical figure, Alexander the Great, who historically was actually a pagan polytheist. There are also historical anachronisms present in the Quran. Number 4. Some stories appear in the Quran more than once. In one version, a line is spoken by one character. In another version, the same line is given to a different character. Because of these and many more evidences, Dr. Hashmi reached a conclusion. He says Muslims should stop holding the view that the Quran is word for word from God. Instead, he says the Quran should be interpreted similarly to how Christians interpret their Bible. Thus, he says that just how Christians view that their Bible is written by limited men, but divinely inspired by God, the Quran should be viewed as written by a limited man, but also divinely inspired by God. A divinely inspired scripture is, even though written through the lens of limited human experience/memory knowledge, the scripture's purpose to relay essential messages of faith, morals, and theology is preserved. The bigger picture of God's desire to pass on the intended faith and morals with key teachings is what matters. Dr. Hashmi's reasoning is simple. If the Quran really were the exact word-for-word eternal divine speech of an all-knowing Allah, then it would contain no historical inaccuracies or errors at all. Allah's own eternal knowledge and eternal divine speech would be perfect. So the presence of these story detail changes or errors points to a different kind of book interpretation than Muslims currently assume. Dr. Hashmi recommends Muslims change how they come to view what is meant by errors, contradictions, and divine inspiration. With this finding, we now see that there is now a better way to understand what Scripture is and how to view it. Scripture is not a word-for-word, letter-for-letter dictation from God. It was written by men who were inspired by God. God made sure the main messages were preserved: the faith, the morals, and the key events he wanted passed down. But those messages were written down by human authors, using their own memories and their own limited experiences. That means the big message stays safe even when a small human detail slips. Once you understand that, the contradiction argument loses its force. With this new perspective, we can look at the genealogies in the Gospels. Matthew and Luke both give a family line for Jesus, and they don't match. Luke's version may be the more literal one, but Matthew's genealogy presentation isn't trying to trick anyone. He's making a point on purpose. Matthew arranges his list into 3 sets of 14 names. Why 14? Because in Hebrew, the letters of David's name add up to 14. Repeating that number 3 times hammers home one idea. Jesus is deeply connected to David as successor to David's throne, even to the point of including the famous King Solomon in the genealogy. Matthew also made his list shorter and to the point. Regular people hearing it could get the gist. The point is that Jesus is the heir to David's throne, the way Solomon was part of that same royal line. We must remember that the Quran also changes stories for its purpose, and so we see this scripture practice in this instance in the genealogy presented in Matthew. So Matthew's genealogy is not about telling a literal genealogy, since it is doing something more than listing names. It's driving home the teaching that Jesus is the rightful successor to David's throne. Matthew's presentation is a teaching point. Muslims also say that the Gospels have historical errors, and thus the Gospels are corrupted. But we should remember the new perspective learned, that even though the Quran has historical errors, Muslims still don't deem the Quran as corrupted. A historical error of the exact year of a census mentioned in the Gospel of Luke is not something God intended as mandatory to pass down as the gospel message. Knowing that specific year is not faith, morals, dogma, nor key event for faith. The Gospel of Luke says Jesus was born in Bethlehem during Herod's time. That's the key event. Jesus being born is the key message God wanted to pass down. That key event can stand on its own without background scenery of an exact date of a census. Another example is the following, and it is my favorite because it shows exactly how the human side of writing works, while the key information is still indeed preserved. Start with Mark. In Mark chapter 6, we read about the death of John the Baptist, since Herod Antipas has John the Baptist executed. Mark calls Herod Antipas king 5 separate times in that one chapter. But that title is incorrect. Herod Antipas was never a king. He was a tetrarch, a ruler who governed a division of a Roman territory. Herod Antipas actually asked Rome to make him king, and the request got him exiled instead. He may have lived like a king, and people living under him may have viewed or treated him like a king. But he never held the official title. The follower of Matthew was writing down what he had learned by word of mouth in his Matthew community. To help organize the beginning writing of Matthew's account, he kept a copy of the Gospel of Mark in front of him as a reference. Now watch what a follower of Matthew does with the word king that is found in the book of Mark. In Matthew 14 verse 1, the follower fixes Mark's mistake. The follower correctly calls Herod a tetrarch, when the Matthew follower writes tetrarch down in Matthew 14:1 with the correct word tetrarch instead of king. Then, just 8 verses later in Matthew 14:9, the follower writes the king. What happened? He started out correcting his source carefully. Then, as he kept working, he drifted back into the wording of the source sitting in front of him. Scholars call this editorial fatigue. You begin an edit with focus, and partway through you slip back into the original language. Anyone who has revised a long document knows that feeling. Notice what this is not. It is not an intentional deception lie. There is no attempt to maliciously deceive anyone. And notice what survives in the key story context regarding the mentioned Herod. Herod Antipas still executed John the Baptist. That key event is completely intact. The only thing that went wrong was a job title. Nobody's faith depends on whether Matthew used the correct Roman administrative term. The essence of important key events are preserved. Dr. Hashmi agrees that parts of the Gospels belong to the genre of historical narrative. In other words, they are trying to report real events that really happened. He does not think the Quran contains that genre at all. He does not believe there is any story in the Quran that should be read as accurate history. That's a meaningful difference, and it's coming from a Muslim Quran scholar.